Hey everybody, and welcome to another video in the Social Psych lecture series. Today's lecture 6. This is when we're going to start the real fun stuff. We're going to talk about social influence, how to get people to do what you want them to do. So I appreciate you sticking around for this lecture series. Maybe you jump right into this one. But here we're going to talk about 2 ways in which you get somebody to do what you want them to do. First, we're going to talk about persuasion, how to be persuasive. What are the best strategies for persuasion? And then we're going to talk about conformity, ways in which you conform to the situation and get other people to conform to your situations. So let's just jump into it. I forgot to do an outline for this one. Sorry about that. So we're going to do persuasion first, and then we're going to do conformity. So that's pretty much the outline. So let's talk about persuasion here. But I want to first define social influence. So social influence is the many ways, and we're going to talk about these 4 ways. So in this video, we're going to talk about the 2 end bits of the tree, and then in the next video, we're going to talk about the 2 middle bits, compliance and obedience. And the many ways in which people affect one another, including changes in attitudes, behaviors, feelings that result from the comments, actions, or even the mere presence of others. So persuasion specifically is the process aimed at changing a person's or group's, can be either one, attitude or behavior toward an event, an idea, an object, another person, or people, by using written or spoken words to convey information, feelings, or reasoning, or a combination thereof. And so persuasion necessarily includes communications, okay? It's necessarily a communication influence. This is, on the other hand, not the same for maybe the other 3, as we'll discuss. So one of the ways in which I want to look at persuasion is probably one of the more common models you'll see in persuasion literature. It's what is considered a dual process model of persuasion, a dual process model of persuasion, because you can see that I have 2 processes here. I have 1 and I have 2. So we have central and our peripheral. And this is called the Elaboration Likelihood Model. Now, a related cousin of the Elaboration Likelihood Model, the ELM, is the Systematic Heuristic Model, the HSM. And so that's why I put those in parentheses here. So we're basically going to talk about persuasion by 2 routes. Okay, by 2 routes. And these 2 routes follow from motivation and ability, and then lead to attitude change. And so we'll discuss the factors and the ability and motivation factors that lead to the processing, one of the 2, and then we'll talk about the factors that promote the actual attitude change. So before we get into that, what are these 2 processes? Well, the peripheral route, or heuristic, these are this is your type 1 that we talked about in a previous episode of dual process thinking. So these are your heuristical processes. These are your simple superficial processing. So simple superficial cues related to the message are going to change the length. Excuse me. Are things like length, cheapers, expertise, or attractiveness. Okay, people using the peripheral route are generally less judicious with their consideration of that information. So simple messages really reign here. And irrelevant cues like rightness, wrongness, or attractiveness generally are ignored. Okay. Central root, though, the systematic processing, this is where persuasion occurs with deliberation. So if you are engaging someone's central root, you better come with the receipts, the details, and the evidence to back up what you're saying, because people are thinking real long and hard, okay? Real long and hard. So you need to weigh arguments, you consider relevant facts and figures, you think about things in a systematic fashion, hence the cousin. So 3 motivating factors for central processing is the issue is personally relevant, okay? Again, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to listen to you, but you better have all of the stuff that I want to hear, okay? Knowledgeable in the domain, okay? I know I know most of the thing you're going to say to me, so I want to be really, really odd right now. You really have to tell me something I don't know in order for me to be moved to your side. And the third factor in motivating us to use this systematic is that if we become personally responsible for the attitude change or the behavior change. So that's going to lead to systematic processing, okay? Quality of the argument. So if it's good quality argument, then, hey, you've won me over. If it's a bad quality argument, sorry, goodbye. Okay. Now, for peripheral processing, motivation and ability factors, these are essentially opposites of the box above it. Sorry. Issue is not personally relevant. If you are distracted or fatigued, so if you're tired or your attention is elsewhere, you're like, yeah, that's fine. Whatever, that's good. And so this is when, if you want to persuade somebody to do something, catch them at their most distracted. Okay? Catch them at their most distracted. Incomplete or hard to comprehend message. If you also want to do something fun by persuading somebody to do something for you, just, talk so fast that people are like, whoa, I can't understand what you're saying to me. Fine, it's fine. The things that I do think are fine. Attitude change, right? And so the things that promote attitude change in peripheral processing are pretty much all heuristics. And we'll talk about some of them. So source attractiveness. So how attractive is the person giving the message? How famous are they? Okay, which is why celebrities and influencers are asked to market and advertise. Number and length of arguments. So if there are a lot of arguments and you have to go through them, you're just like, oh my God, why? So this is actually a crucial thing to note for 12 Angry Men, the course film, or if you want to watch it on your own, 12 Angry Men. Number and length of arguments. Here we're talking about several arguments that the jurors just listened to in the trial, and they just want to get out of there. They're hot, they're distracted. Oh, it is. They just want to say guilty and get out of there. But there's the one guy who's like, no, let me engage your central processing. Please bear with me. This is really important. And he was not persuaded, even though 11 other jurors had consensus. 11 other jurors had consensus. So it's just like, come on, man, join us or die. Well, no, let me engage your systematic processing. You can do it. Everyone gather around. I'll tell you about it. Okay. So those are really important. Those are really important things. This box right here, this box really tells us whether or not we're going to go here. Even if these two things, let's take, for example, we're distracted or fatigued, but we're knowledgeable in the domain. So where do we go, central or peripheral? Well, that's because messages tend to be a mix of both. Okay. But if you have a message that's targeting this route, you're going to be way more successful. So these are the features of persuasion attempts. So who, what, to whom, and how. So who, the source. Who is the person giving the message? Generally speaking, these are politicians, influencers, celebrities, lawyers. Lawyers, big one, because they're the ones who are trying to persuade the jury on either side. What is the message? What is the idea or event that the person is or object the person is trying to persuade you to use, to attend, to believe, or whatever? And then how are they going to get that message across? You can see my arrows here. Who, to what, to how, to whom, right? So here we talk about the source, then the message. What is that source saying? And then how are they saying it? What channel are they attempting? Are they trying to engage your central processing route, or are they trying to engage your peripheral processing route? And then finally, who is their audience? Is it a distracted person, or is it an expert in the field? That's crucial. Now, I'll give you an interesting thing to note about law psychology or legal psychology, which is the audience is really crucial for each of these things. So here we have a lawyer. Their message is, we'll say a defense attorney. My client didn't do the thing that they're accused of. And so here I'm going to engage as much peripheral route as possible. And I don't want any experts in my in my jury, in my audience, because they're going to be engaging the wrong channel. I want peripheral route channels open, not central route channels open. And so let's get rid of all of those possible experts. So this is why you rarely see psychologists on juries. You can try to talk your way into it, but I was selected. I went through voir dire one time, which is jury questioning, jury selection. And I said that I was a psychology graduate student, and they're like, "Get him out of here!" And so I got dismissed because they're like, "Oh, this person knows too much about psychology, and I don't want them here." At least the prosecution or the defense didn't want me there. Okay. Now, let's talk about the source and their characteristics, shall we? So, credibility is really important. So, the credibility of the company that's trying to get you to buy a product. Subaru, love, it's what makes a Subaru. Blah, right? The person who is in the advertisement or the politician. The source, is it in Cosmopolitan magazine, or is it in the New York Times or Washington Post? So expertise is most important when you're talking about matters of fact, position of authority, or knowledge. 4 to 5 dentists don't influence our feelings about bowling balls, but they do about toothpaste. I really want to know what that 5th dentist is like. No, I don't really like this toothpaste. I don't think it prevents cavities like you say it, though. That's just like 80% of dentists. Where's the other 20%? What is the other 20% doing? Right? Even tangential expertise. So people who play doctors on TV. You're like, wait a minute. Is there a doctor on board? Well, I play a doctor. I know a little bit. I remember some of my lines. So perceived motivation is also part of credibility, right? So the audience has the perception of whether or not you're credible. So people arguing against self-interest seem to be more credible. So if a prisoner is arguing for longer prison sentences, we're like, huh, okay, I'll listen. Male representatives for women's rights also, okay? label yourself a feminist. And white abolitionists. And then the sleeper effect. This occurs when messages from unreliable sources initially exert very little influence, but later cause attitudes to shift. So the sleeper effect is insidious in persuasion because you can plant an idea and then it's like, it's fine. It's kind of like Inception in the film where they're like, let's go into people's dreams and we'll plant an idea. And you're like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. And then eventually the idea is supposed to turn into something big. Okay. So I have an example for the sleeper effect. In 1951, at the height of, at the beginning part of the Cold War, and the nuclear arms race began, participants were asked about the likelihood that nuclear subs would be built in the near future. A few days later, they read an essay about the imminence of nuclear subs, so how quickly they were supposed to be coming, and told the essay was written either by a highly credible physicist, Robert Oppenheimer, or a journalist for a Soviet propaganda newspaper. Naturally, people were more persuaded by the physicist. However, when measured again 4 weeks later, people who had been told the essay was written by a Soviet propagandist had changed attitudes. That's the sleeper effect. The second source characteristic that I want to talk about is attractiveness. So physical attractiveness and our similarity to that person's attractiveness. This follows one of the stereotypes / heuristic that I may have mentioned in a previous video, but here I'll further explore. What is beautiful is good is the heuristic. What is beautiful is good. So this applies to beyond just physical attractiveness. It applies to status and prestige, even for unrelated products. Why does it matter that Angelina Jolie and Bono are spokespeople for the plight of Africa? Like, Bono's product Red, for example. It's because they are high status, they have high prestige, they are generally speaking beautiful. Angelina Jolie maybe more so than Bono, unless you like Bono, right? So not only do we have physical beauty, status, and prestige, this is why these people become spokespeople for various issues. Of course, this doesn't matter to their actual position about what's going on in Africa. It has nothing to do with it. It's how we perceive the source characteristics on whichever route we're traveling, the potential or peripheral. Similarity, on the other hand, is more important on matters of opinion. So if we're comparing credibility and attractiveness, well, if we were talking about facts, then credibility is more important. It's why Facebook adds the little eye icon on news articles, because it wants you to know the source and it wants you to get an idea of the credibility of that source. Whereas attractiveness is helpful for matters of opinion. A weight loss plan, ask someone who has lost weight. Best makeup, maybe find someone who is most like you and wears makeup like you. Bare minerals, what about things like brands like Neutrogena or Almay? I'm talking about makeup. Use beautiful models or actresses, and then they convince you they're just like you. That's why Dove, Neutrogena, Maybelline, all these companies use somebody who thinks like you do. Like, oh, my face is dry. Oh man, my face is dry too. We're like the same. You just have millions of dollars more than me. That's wow, our faces are so dry though. And so, but that is literally a matter of opinion rather than what the actual thing does to your face. Okay. Now, the third source characteristic that I want to talk about is fear appeals. I talk about fear appeals quite a bit in health psychology, and here you have somebody smoking what is considered a loaded gun. It's an advertisement in that one, right? And then I have a study here that I'll talk about in just a second. So why would somebody use fear to be persuasive? Well, its main goal is to disrupt your elaborative processing. Okay. Its main goal is to disrupt that. So you go peripheral route, like, oh, I don't want to smoke then because I don't want to shoot myself in the mouth. Okay. They're most effective when they depict a significant and relevant threat. And this is why climate change threats don't work, because climate change is so nebulous and distant, or at least it has been, that fear about what might happen with the effects of climate change and global warming fall on sort of deaf ears. They just kind of hit you and they're like, oh, It's because the fear appeals need to be significant and relevant. Okay. They convey effective responses that seem easy to accomplish. Okay. So if we look at a study like this, where a participant is either given instructions on reducing cigarettes, fear for reducing cigarettes, or instructions and fear, you can see a decrease in the amount of cigarettes smoked per day. So this is instructions for cessation. This is just fear, like, don't smoke or your lungs are going to mutiny. And then this one is cessation instructions and your lungs are also going to mutiny. You better do something about it. So that's what this shows here. Offer a solution. If you're going to use fear to be persuasive, offer a solution. You don't want to frighten people so much that they then go into denial mode and deny the threat rather than act against the threat. Okay? Give them a solution so they have something to use to act against the threat. Okay? And then the final source characteristic that I will mention is culture. Here's an image of the way in which the World War II and then the following Korean War and Cold War was trying to get people to act and be a part of something greater than themselves. And so they came up with these like very patriotic images. Like here we have two guys building what appears to be some sort of airplane. They're riveting and they're doing something. And they're saying, it says united we win. Great. Culture has a lot to do. And if you could just be like, America, 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 USA, USA, USA. This really just like takes away central processing. And you're like, yeah, USA, USA. This is kind of the tactic that Stephen Colbert used on the Colbert Report. Of course, he was playing an idiot, a character he made from his time at The Daily Show, and he just turned it up to 11 for that show. And, a lot of the times he would just end an argument by just getting the audience to start chanting USA. And it's just like an end all kind of thing. So culture has a lot to do with how motivating they are. So if you can invoke somebody's culture, their sense of self in that culture, well, then you're going to go down peripheral route rather than central route. Finally, the presence, I thought culture was the last one, but presence of opposing arguments is actually the last one. Now, are you debating an opponent? Is there an opposing argument somewhere? Opposing arguments, generally speaking, will grab people's elaborative processing, the central route processing. If you are trying to get people to change their behavior and change their behavior quickly through peripheral route processing, then you don't want other arguments getting in the way. Now, the channel characteristics. So, how are you going to get them to start thinking about it? Where's the persuasion actually starting from? Okay, so is it active or passive? We kind of mentioned that active is going to be more elaborative and passive is going to be more peripheral. Okay, so if it's a minor issue, it's pretty easy to persuade somebody. Okay, passive route, generally speaking, is fine and it may be better. Okay, major issue, on the other hand, is probably going to require more active thinking and active engagement with the issue. So you will be asking a lot, and you will need a lot to be persuasive. Are you going to do this in person or through some sort of medium? Okay, in person, more persuasive. That's why politicians go door to door. Media, you get a better spread. It depends, and because presidential campaigns, just by way of example here, in the United States, presidential campaigns are ridiculously long, and so politicians in those presidential campaigns can do both. They can go door to door and talk with people, take selfies, whatever. But they can they can also engage the media through rallies and commercials and internet campaigns, etc. Right? Is it going to be written or is it going to be seen or heard? Is it going to be audio visual? Is it written or AV? Written messages need to be extremely concrete. Okay, and they need to be eloquent and something that would invoke elaborative and central route thinking. So written is really good for complex messages, and because you can just lay out each thing, you don't have to worry about saying the wrong thing or having a weird facial expression, etc. But if you're going to go the more audio visual route, these are for like inconsequential or quick sound bites. You really don't want to engage any thinking whatsoever. You kind of want to engage feeling more than anything, which is why campaign ads are so visceral these days. The Willie Horton ad for George H.W. Bush, in 1992 really sort of hits this one home because it was about this guy named Willie Horton who was got a day pass and ended up murdering somebody at a day. He was a convict in a prison, and he ended up murdering somebody on a day pass, and his case was used against Bill Clinton in a very, very racist kind of way. But that's not the intent of the advertisement. The intent of the advertisement was to highlight how George H.W. Bush was the better candidate because of this visceral racist thing, and get your fire going if you agree with whatever George Bush was saying at the time. Now, the audience, their age is going to matter. Younger people are more susceptible to messages because the youth probably have less info about those issues, and so peripheral route processing. This also has to do with brain development as well. Fewer frontal lobe resources. Okay, and there's usually a gap in attitudes between old people and young people. But it's hard to determine whether or not this is cohort effects or actual age. Okay. It'd be like attitudes change because we get older, or just cohorts of people at different time periods, at different ages. Okay, so the Vietnam era with people who were born in the early 1900s versus teenagers in the 1960s. Like, is that a cohort effect, or is it that because those people who were born earlier have different attitudes toward communism? I don't know. How much distraction or involvement the audience has for the message. So distracted and less involved leads to less critical thought, less time for prepping of counter arguments. Okay. Education. The higher the education, the more central route processing is engaged, especially if the educated people in the audience are personally knowledgeable about the thing, and so it's more difficult to persuade highly educated individuals. People in positive moods tend to be more open to change. Okay, people who are listening to persuasive messages while eating or listening to beautiful music show more attitude change because the beautiful music puts people into a better mood. It's actually pretty cool. And then the final piece is a thinking style. It's called need for cognition. It's individual difference. So we all have different thinking styles, and we all have different needs for cognition. So the best way to describe this, the easiest way to describe this is like what is the degree to which you like to think deeply, to like do puzzles, read science articles, play with logic, solve problems, etc. Right. So the higher the audience member is for need for cognition, the more elaborative processing and the more central route processing they will engage in, and people who with less need for cognition will be more open to peripheral route processing and therefore more easily persuaded. Okay, so these are the tools you need. These are the tools that you need to persuade people. Get them tired AF. Get the prettiest person you can find. Start changing minds. Get them in a good mood. Start changing minds. Boom. Done. First way, social psychology, get you to do things for people or get you what you want. Okay. The second social influence thing that I wanted to talk about is conformity. Conformity. So we did persuasion. Now we're doing conformity. Conformity is implicit or explicit. And so this is behavior or beliefs. Changing behavior or beliefs in response to direct or indirect pressure from real or imagined others. There's that imagined others thing from the first lecture video, which is great, right? So conformity is either implicit or explicit. We either conform because we should or because we think we need to. That's the explicit one. Or we conform because we do it anyways. We're going to do it, and that's the way we're going to do it. All right. So here's a great example. And it is a classic experiment. And it is highly robust, which means it replicates rather easily. So back in the 1940s, a researcher by the name of Solomon Asch really wanted to study conformity. And he was really interested in the bridge between implicit and explicit conformity. And it's such a exquisite, simple design. So what he had was a sort of a deceptive study that was advertised to potential participants. He gathered a group of research assistants and other students in his lab, and he called them Confederates. And participants came into the study, and the deception was that it was just a visual perception study, that they were just interested in a group of people taking a test, a visual test in a room at the same time. Okay. All they had to do was measure a judge line, a target line, that's X, to a group of lines, A, B, and C. So I'm sure you can clearly see that line X is the same length as line B. That's pretty simple, right? But here's the catch. So it's pretty straightforward. When subjects were by themselves, as opposed to in a group of people and a group of Confederates, they were very accurate. This 97% is because they were the screen projection was far enough away that they kind of did have to squint sometimes. And if their eyesight wasn't 100%, if they didn't have 20/20 vision, then maybe they got it wrong. So 97% within a margin of error of totally accurate. Okay. So this was in 1930. So the initial one occurred in 1937, and then he followed this up in the 1940s, and then they gained national traction, and shows like Candid Camera in the late 1940s, early 1950s played with it a little bit by doing like elevator gags and stuff like that. But the key thing that I want you to note from Asch's study and subsequent studies in the 1940s and 50s is that people follow examples. And this is critical. People follow examples. And so, like I said, when they were alone, these subjects did fine. Okay, they were able to match the line. But when they were with a group of people who were Confederates to the study, that's when things started changing, especially when those Confederates were instructed to choose the wrong answer. So here in this other variation using standard line and then 1, 2, and 3, you can see the standard line is the same as 2, right? And so 1 and 3 are wrong. But then you actually ask the Confederates to give the wrong answer. It's great. It's great. They'll go around the room. It kind of looks like this. So here's the experimenter. The projector is over here. And they're kind of just going around this table. And so, excuse you. Thank you. So the experimenter is right here. And then they'll just go around in order. And you can see that the subject is strategically placed at the end of the question line. They always go in order. They always start with 1 and then go all the way around. Always in order. And then a Confederate right after that one, just to sort of round it out. They were never really at the end of the line. They were sort of right before the end. Some variations do have the participant at the very end of the line, right? And as my slides here says, 75% of participants went with the incorrect majority at least once. Okay, so those were called critical trials, when Confederates said the wrong choice. So they either said line 1 or line 3. They'll probably say line 1 in this case. So they go around the room and they would be like 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and we get to the participant and they'd be like, 1. So on critical trials, 3/4 of the participant went with the incorrect majority at least one time. Some people didn't conform. And then some people conformed on every single critical trial. Internal monologue is kind of like, everybody seems so sure. Am I not seeing this right? Something must be up with my eyes or my glasses or something. Let me clean my glass lenses here. Put them in. Okay, well, if they're certain that it's 1, then it's probably going to be 1, right? So that's how it works. Get through. So why would somebody conform? Well, it's actually fairly simple. Uncertainty. Uncertainty, generally speaking, leads somebody to conform. How many people are there doing the same thing? Okay. How much cognitive load do we have? Okay. How much cognitive load are we under? We conform when we are under severe cognitive load, when we're thinking about and efforting so much thinking. Okay. So those are the conditions in which we conform. Okay. Functionally speaking, we are social animals. And so there are 2 kinds of influencing from other people. There's normative influence and there's informative influence. Normative influence is like these zebras here, to fulfill expectations, to gain acceptance, to fit in, to avoid rejection or disapproval. The likelihood of rejection is quite high when not following social norms. We get ostracized for that. Okay? So conformity, when people are free to do as they please, they usually imitate each other. Those zebras. Well, they have to conform in order to fool lions and cheetahs and hyenas. All those black and white lions are like, ah, right? So their conformity is survival. So when do we use normative influence? When there is no objective correct answer. If the task is ambiguous. Okay. So that's when we use normative influence. And we use normative influence quite a bit. When somebody goes, yeah, nonconformity, I'm going to be a nonconformist, they're generally bucking normative influence in this case because they are not fulfilling the expectations society has for them to gain acceptance or fit in. They want to do the opposite, right? They don't care about rejection or disapproval. So nonconformity is normative influence bucking. We're going to dismantle that trend. Informative influence, on the other hand, is the desire, the motivation to be correct, okay? And to be like the social input that we are receiving about reality, okay? So why do you walk into so a funny teaching example that a lot of my colleagues do is they'll have, you know, the early comer group before class starts, like stand and face the back wall or something like that. And, you know, when the latecomers come in, well, not the latecomers, but the ones that like come in like toward when class starts, they look around and they go, why are people standing like this? And then some of them will slowly do it. They'll go, I'm gonna stand up and, you know, face the back. Informative influence occurs when there is a correct answer that we can arrive at. Stand up and face the back door. I guess that's what I should do right now. The factors that affect conformity are things like group size. So in the Asch study, there were, 10 people or so. The more they added, so they did various variations. And you can see here that they had the subject by themselves, one person, 2 people, 3, 4, 8, and 16. You can see that at about 3 people, it sort of asymptotes to how comfortable we are with, normative and informative influence, right? Unanimity. So if you have a bunch of people, group size. So in the Asch studies, if the people conformed a third of the time, then, people conformed a third of the time, but when one Confederate broke rank, they were told to break rank sometimes, then conformity just dropped about 30% to about 5% of the time. Maybe I wasn't crazy because now this person and I share a bond and we can commiserate about that. So the more unanimous a behavior is, then the more we're likely to conform to that behavior. Expertise. If somebody has more expertise in something, we're more likely to trust them because we get info. Normative influence. Or informative influence, actually. Culture. Collective cultures are more concerned with conformity because that leads to group harmony. Individualistic cultures tend not to care too much about conformity unless it has to do with authority and obedience, which we'll talk about in the next video. Gender. We used to think that women conformed more. This is not a gender difference that I'm going to go down because it's not right. It probably had something to do with materials they were studying. In male-dominated domains, like deer hunting, for example, women tend to conform more because they don't do it as much. But when you compare that to female domains, like, or traditionally or stereotypically female domains, like child rearing, men will conform more to the things that their wives or partners do. Okay. And so there may be subtle things there, but only if you take an existing societal structure or societal stereotype to make the comparison, which isn't really showing you a gender difference, but it's actually showing you a stereotype or gender role difference. Time. This is an interesting one. So Asch has been replicated over and over and over again. But even within like 40 or 50 years, and even still, it's a very robust effect. And so over time, we see conformity being the case, but it's really hard to pin down the mechanism for time showing conformity over it. It's an interesting one. Couple of reasons is growing individualism. So Vietnam, anti-war protests, hippies and free love, women and gay rights and liberation, and civil rights. So by the 1960s, it was all about rejecting the establishment, saying no and envisioning a more authentic life. Things end up changing. But then the status quo then takes over again, and people then begin to conform, and so you need various cycles of breaking the establishment and more authentic life. It's an interesting thing. So time and conformity, factors affecting conformity, time, maybe. So normative influence is about fitting in, right? So if we can compare that to then not fitting in or being outcasted, ostracism, Schachter in 1955 did a quick study where he had nonconformers appear to risk social rejection and ostracism. So when one Confederate, who was considered to be the nonconformer in the group, stubbornly disagrees with the unanimous opinion of the group, that person is then taunted, verbally attacked, and rejected by subjects, people who are intended to be a part of a decision-making group, right? Verbally attacked, taunted, rejected. It's rough, man. So that's why normative influence is pretty critical for conformity. If you want somebody to do something, you have to engage normative influence. really have to engage normative influence. Now let's talk about the person. What makes individuals as well as the situations more conformist? So those who are less likely to conform, so you can read that any of the two ways you want. So if you're less likely to conform, you're going to have these traits. More likely to form, you're not going to have these traits. I hope that makes sense. So if you have a high need to achieve, you'll be less likely. Propensity to be a leader. Talk more about leadership with groups in another video. Greater self-awareness and high self-esteem. You'll be less likely to conform because you won't be so caught up in the normative influence aspect of it. Okay. But however, little is known about the personality characteristics of those who tend to conform versus those who don't. Now, situational variables are interesting because it has to do with ambiguity. Like, over and above. If a situation's ambiguous, people are more likely to conform because there is normative and informative influence on conformity in an ambiguous situation. Unconscious conformity is the last thing I want to talk about. We conform without even thinking about it. This is where the implicit stuff comes from. Okay, so it's the chameleon effect that I want to specifically talk about. The reason why it's called the chameleon effect is because this is conformity on a imitation level. This is conformity through mimicry, basically. Okay, so how this worked was that a participant was paired with another participant to describe photos together, and that was the cover story. Okay, the other person that the participant was with was actually a Confederate, somebody who was in on the study, and they were told to behave in certain ways. They either rubbed their face or shook their foot while doing the task of describing photos. And in another room, observers were measuring and recording the participants' movements, and specifically whether or not they rubbed their face or shook their foot. So they were also videotaped at this point too. And then they were recorded and then coded for these things. Okay, specifically for these things. And what they found was that behavioral mimicry occurred and the participants didn't even know that they did that. And here's the funny thing. So how do you then, it's like, well, how do you, Dr. Swan, how do you say that this was unconscious? Well, they did a manipulation check after that was all said and done. And they would ask them, depending on what who the Confederate they were paired with, what they did, rub their face or, shook their foot. Do you remember rubbing your face or shaking your foot? And the participant would likely say no. Excuse me. No. And you can see here that there is quite a bit of a difference. This is percentage, this is times per minute. So how many times per minute? And then this is the group where the Confederate rubbed their face, and this is the group where the Confederate shakes their foot. And you can see that the participant does the same thing most of the time. But what I like about this is that people like to shake their feet several times a minute. But the point of here is that the conformity is unconscious and passive. Okay? So why do we do it? Well, it smooths social interactions. And you may have heard the phrase, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Well, it's because it is. It increases rapport and liking between the two people. And if you're mimicking somebody unconsciously, not doing it like Quit saying what I'm saying game. Hate that game. This is unintentional and passive, and so you're just doing it, but implicitly it makes the other person feel good because they're like, oh, you're doing what I'm doing. I'm doing it, and I like that I'm doing it, and so therefore I like you because you're doing it. And so, I mean, and that's on an implicit level as well. It's just like, it's just creating a bond in a non-direct way. Oh, there's the Y. That is the end of this particular video. Please leave your comments and feedbacks down below. Generate your questions. Until the next video, bye.